Today I will argue for the use of catalogues in ancient Greek poetry as an aesthetic device to deliberately recreate the epic's typical serialization on a micro scale. The result, a well-timed zooming in and out, engages both the external and internal audience with the narrative scope of the specific performance, especially with the experience of story time. Now, what is this narrative scope? Presumably not the scale suggested, or as some would argue, evidenced by our written versions of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, or of the Hesiodic Theogony and the Works and Days. Concerning other epic material like the fragmentarily extant genealogical and antiquarian epic and the suggested cyclic epics, we cannot even try to imagine a performance practice, though I will return to the epic cycle with regard to narrative scope. As a whole, the Iliad and the Odyssey as we now have them are not designed to be performed in their entirety. Regardless the question whether the Homeric epics originated as transcripts of successful performances or as scripts to guarantee the success of the next performance, in the form in which they came down to us, they qualify, in the words of Nagy, as scripture, a reasonably fixed written form that was used as a study and a critic's copy. The alleged thematical unity of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, a unity sought for in what is essentially an epic container, has led scholars to reconstruct performance contexts for the whole. In his 1992 Homeric Soundings, Taplin famously suggested a tripartition of the Iliad, suited to an integral delivery in 3 consecutive nights at the royal court, more or less similar to the way Odysseus in the Odyssey recounts his adventures to such an extent and with such proficiency that his audience almost forgets to go to sleep. And even when encouraged to do so at the expense of the secondary narrator, the Phaeacians refuse to do so. They rather hear out the remainder. Taplin's reconstruction leaves out Book 10, the Dolonia. Several reasons are given for this choice. Of course, the Dolonia's questionable contribution to the Iliad's plot features prominently. The nightly expedition appears to be a later insertion, judging by its superfluity and the possibility to take it out without damage to the plot, rather the contrary, and by linguistic and metrical features that betray the passage as late or at least later. Taking it out allows for a more convenient tripartition of the epic into parts of equal size that start and finish with or at temporal markers by the poet, like when the next dawn appeared. In itself, the proposed deletion of Book 10 from performance is interesting enough, but its worth lies in the arguments provided for a further editing of the transmitted text for the sake of performability. At the heart of the argument lies the observation or intuition that performance always requires performance flexibility in adapting the available material to the requirements of the performance circumstances and the audience. The latter usually needs to be catered to taste to an extent. It seems that a taste for the entire Iliad and Odyssey is a reader's one. Such it was for the Alexandrian critics, occupied with textual criticism as well as with textual constitution. From an abundance of handed over trusted and mistrusted verses and passages, the Alexandrian scholars focused on an original text, now something put on a par with the Pisistrian redaction, with regard to readership, an alleged edition that was well ahead of its time. For educational purposes, a written Iliad and Odyssey may well serve the objectives aimed at. It still does, but rightfully raises questions on its development from an oral performance tradition. Evidence for a more fragmentary form of Homeric poetry in passages or even shorter scenes stems from various sources from antiquity. The practice of Homeric performance is regularly equated with the epic internal delivery of the Kleia Andron. Now let's see if we can get that on screen. As it is found in Achilles' singing to his own lyre play in Iliad 9, Demodocus's performance of shorter passages upon request, and Odysseus' autobiography at the Phaeacian royal court, a delivery totaling over 2,200 lines of hexametric poetry. Written editions of Homeric epic regularly refer to the titles of episodes in their book division, titles quoted by various 5th and 4th century authors, without reference to the Homeric container titles as they are known and quoted from the later 3rd century BCE onwards. Classical Greek authors, citing from Homer, do so quite sparingly, without any ambition to recite larger passages as free embedded discourse. Antiquity's most important source on Homeric performance, prior to the 3rd century, Plato's Ion, raises more questions than it provides answers to. Socrates' conversation with and interrogation of Ion evidences that Homeric poetry was recited in a competitive setting and that required rhapsodes to conform to objectifiable standards of delivery, but it does not provide clues as to the choice of passages the rhapsodes were to recite, nor to the length of such passages in order to be reviewed by those judging the rhapsode's capacities. Clear at least is that the passages were of limited size, surely not surpassing the size of an average book, which in the reconstruction of Taplin adds up to about an hour of recitation. No wonder then that the Homeric epic makes the impression of serialization of longer and shorter passages, many of which may be omitted, added, or inserted elsewhere without serious consequences for the plot of the epic as we have it, and with certainly no consequences for the recitations of episodes. Many passages, clusters of verses and verses, already have been amended or obelized, often with reference to the catering of specific audiences. An interesting example of the supposed flexibility of epic poets in the catering of their audiences is presented in the pseudo-Hesiodic Certamen, the contest, which suggests that the narrative epic poet and the didactic cataloging poet conformed to shared practices, freely citing, combining, and recombining from a mnemonic databank of usable passages and references, with the liberty to make use of ingenious finds of the competition. Now, the Certamen is not considered a sufficiently trustworthy witness to the performance practice, let alone to the lives and the works of its two competitors, Homer and Hesiod. What it does show, however, is epic poetry's fragmented and serializing nature. The latter was an incentive for Martin's 2013 article on Op Epic. The notion that especially pseudo-Hesiodic poetry like the Catalogue and the Scutum features characteristics that qualify as trash aesthetic nowadays. Serialization, loudness, raising the ante, slow motion, cataloging. All features appear in epic outside pseudo-Hesiod, of course, but their occurrence and their frequency is diluted by the intervening narrative in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and supposedly in Specimen of the cyclic epic as well, though much of the extant fragmentary material proves in line with Martin's trash aesthetic. Trash aesthetic becomes the more apparent when heavily condensed, as in Hesiod's Catalogue of Women. The poet's unwillingness or incapacity to dilute results in pulp epic. But even poets or composers or editors who do dilute end up with a trash aesthetic feature like serialization and cataloging from time to time. The Iliad's Catalogue of Ships and the series of A Kills B, the Odyssey's serialization of adventures, and the Catalogue of Deceased Women. Such catalogues in ancient Greek epic poetry seem to appear randomly and unexpectedly, and sometimes to the dismay of the performing poet or the primary narrator. Muses are invoked to support the effort, itself explicitly presented as surpassing the capacity of the individual performer, as we find it in Iliad Book 2, where the poet says, "This is too much, too big of a job for me to perform." The catalogue of ships in Iliad 2 and the catalogue of women in Odyssey 11, reminiscent of the Hesiodic catalogues, are presented as in principle non-limited, without external interference or to the satisfaction of the performer. The lists may be extended as easily as the epic narrative itself. Items may easily be inferred or added in accordance with circumstances and audience. Performing before a Pan-Ionian audience, Homer may well have chosen to name all the known cities in Asia Minor, and to anachronistically make the inhabitants of the island Aegina subservient to the Athenians. We should only think of Plutarch's comment. A non-complete catalogue, like Hesiod's catalogue of mortal women, attached to the Theogony, does not provide clues as to its compositional function, nor as to its intended size and completion. The serialization presented on a smaller scale in the catalogue reflects the larger scale serialization that characterizes epic poetry. Without sufficient clues as to the epic internal thematic organization and completion, even compilers in antiquity, we should only think of Aristarchus' remarks on the completion of the Odyssey at 21 to 96, hold different opinions on how to end an epic poem. Modern scholarship acknowledges epic's inherent infinity, both in the reconstruction of the original version and in the evaluation of thematic unity. Iliad Book 24, its most telling example. Catalogues also function in this internal organization. A list of Greek and Trojan troops opens the way for a more detailed serialized account of the exploits and fates of, if not all, many of them. Each entry in the Hesiodic catalogue of women allows for further digression and detailing. It is up to the poet to exploit the possibility, or to cater to his own or his audience's mere pleasure in strings of names and factual knowledge for its own sake, to quote from West 1985. Lists like the Iliadic ship catalogue and the Hesiodic names of the Nereids involve the external audience in the poet's challenge to cater to all tastes present. The Odyssean catalogue of women suits the demands of the internal audience, the Phaeacians. In their deliberate fragmentation, catalogues are suggestive of the epic narrative's potential for serialization, episodic demarcation, and sequencing. Microscale in the catalogue, macroscale in performance. With respect to the internal audience, the Odyssean catalogue of deceased women provides, I argue, antiquity's clearest example and picture of both the Homeric performance practice and of the application and compositional usefulness of catalogues therein. The catalogue of deceased women forms an integral part of Odysseus' Apologoi, his autobiography of the last 10 years, that he provides in response to his hosts informing after his name and his provenance. The Phaeacians have already made clear that they do not regularly receive guests from the outside world, as they live rather secluded since their self-chosen move away from the violent Cyclopes. They have also shown to be aware of great events in the outside world, particularly of the war for Troy, which is for them an enjoyable story with an almost legendary ring rather than a personalized experience. Against that background, Odysseus identifies himself as the legendary sacker of Troy, about whom the Phaeacian singer Demodocus has just narrated two passages, one on the quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles, the best of the Aegeans, a quarrel further unknown to us, and one on the construction of the wooden horse, an episode that probably featured prominently in the epic cycle, on which Virgil drew when composing his elaborate report of the sack of the city in Book 2. Identifying as the sacker of Troy, Odysseus resorts to telling a series of tales to account for his 10-year disappearance from the known world. Some of these tales refer to places and entities well known to his audience. Some feature unbelievable eventualities and places. Clearly, the Phaeacians are not out to hear the truth. They wish to be entertained. Odysseus is not necessarily bound to telling the truth either. In the interplay between hosts and guests, he fulfills the role of a professional singer, replacing Homer for almost 4 books, and tries to receive a specific reward for his efforts, a safe passage home and, if possible, valuable gifts to take home with him. These valuable gifts come in handy in another respect as well. The claim that he is Odysseus brings with it the potentially painful but silent question: what in the world happened to him that he ended up in the current position, without comrades, without loot from the sack of Troy, without a ship of his own, shipwrecked on a strange island? Odysseus' story is a serialized account of various adventures that cost him comrades, and eventually his ship as well. The distinct episodes are arranged in a pattern using the sea as the means of passage, both in the literal and in the organizational sense. The sea keeps the episodes together and is suggestive of the serialization of the episodes itself. Some episodes are smaller, some are more elaborate. What is remarkable is that the episodes do not react on each other's content other than keeping a score of losses. The apologoi passage is internally organized through cross-references, and especially in Circe's prediction of the way forward, a teleological sequencing with a pivotal role for the visit to the island of the sun. For some reason, it proves impossible to simply pass it without ever setting foot on it. The account of the adventurous journey is a beautiful example of the way serialization or sequencing of passages is used to wave smaller bits of narrative into a story with a wider scope, this time by the secondary narrator in an instance of instant myth-making before a live audience. In Book 23, when Odysseus recounts his adventures to his wife after their reunion and lovemaking, we find the Catalogue variant, of which books 9 to 12 are the more elaborate version. Yet another feature of the apologoi evidences the usefulness of catalogues as a narrative device. Having told a series of larger-scale episodes, Odysseus arrives at a point where he finds it necessary to urge his hosts to allow for him to stop. It is getting late and all should go to sleep by now. His audience, however, does not agree to this proposition. They are tremendously entertained by their skilled guest and long to hear more. Who thinks of sleep at such a moment of suspense? Odysseus' suggestion to go to sleep, however, is the direct result of his producing a catalogue as part of his tale. From Book 11, line 225 onwards, until 3 to 8 over 100 lines, Odysseus has listed numerous deceased women, all mentioned with reference to their great deeds of the sons they bore. His exhaustion follows from this exercise. He says, I cannot tell or name all the wives and daughters of heroes that I saw, ere that immortal night would wane. This leads him to suggest the break. At the same time, he relates his effort to the temporal span of the night, since he cannot name all before reaching a reasonable point at where to pause the narration. He breaks it off. The catalogue in the apologoi, therefore, is deliberately deployed as a narrative device to not only suggest condensation within the narrative, but also in the experience of story time. The internal audience is being prepared for a pause in the narration through the condensed form of episodic sequencing, the catalogue, as is the external audience through Odysseus's confessing his fatigue. During the break, Odysseus gets one more request, based on King Alcinous's earlier perception of his guest's emotional state, when Demodocus sang of the Trojan War and the loss of life it caused. Now that Odysseus is in the middle of describing his visit to the netherworld and his encounters with the souls of Tiresias and his mother, Anticleia, could he perhaps elaborate on the encounters with souls of brothers in arms? So he does, again in a series of larger scale episodes, only to resort to cataloguing again from verse 5, 6, 8. This time, cataloguing the wrongdoers punished forever. Is it any wonder then that this catalogue, again, ends in the ascertainment of the secondary narrator that he cannot possibly go on, as the indicator for both the internal and the external audience that he is about to pause his narration? Interestingly, Dionysius of Halicarnassus comments on the orator's use of catalogues to suggest zooming in and out between levels of narrative compression and elaboration. Citing from Demosthenes, he provides an example of very compressed catalogue-like narration and asks the question what the same account would have been like if each entry had been discussed fuller. For reasons of audience expectations and focus, Dionysius concludes that the catalogue form is an efficient tool to heighten audience's attention and elicit their response. His demonstration serves as a clue for the way Homer, Hesiod, uses this narrative device to manage the expectations of an epic performance audience, in this case, and among other clues, to suggest pausing an epic narrative within a seemingly endless epic container. Thank you for your attention.